HOA blocked my cabin access. She had no idea I owned the only bridge in chapter 1. The morning mist clung to Pine Lake like a gossamer veil as Tom Mitchell pulled his battered pickup truck to a stop at the familiar wooden barrier. For 37 years he had driven this same route every weekend, crossing the narrow bridge that spanned the rushing waters of Clearwater Creek to reach his family cabin nestled among the towering pines on the far shore. Today, however, something was different. A brand-new metal gate blocked his path, complete with a shiny brass lock and an official-looking sign that made his blood pressure spike. The sign read in bold black letters, HOA restricted access, authorized vehicles only, followed by a lengthy paragraph of legal text that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. Tom stepped out of his truck and walked closer to examine the obstruction. The gate was professional-grade sturdy steel painted forest green to blend with the surroundings. Someone had invested serious money in this barrier. He pulled out his reading glasses and studied the fine print on the sign, discovering that the Pine Lake Homeowners Association had apparently decided that his weekly trips to the cabin were no longer welcome. According to the notice, all residents were required to register their vehicles with the HOA and pay an annual access fee of $2,000. Non-compliance would result in immediate suspension of bridge crossing privileges. The whole thing was signed by one Margaret Whitmore, President, Pine Lake HOA, with today's date prominently displayed. Tom had never heard of Margaret Whitmore, or any homeowners association for that matter. His family had owned the cabin since 1987, when his father bought the property as a weekend retreat. The deed was clear and unambiguous, granting them full access rights to the cabin via the existing bridge. There had never been any mention of an HOA or access fees or vehicle registration requirements. He walked back to his truck and grabbed his cell phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Pete Rodriguez, the local sheriff, who had become a friend over the years. Pete answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who had dealt with Tom's occasional calls about trespassers or vandalism at the cabin. "Hey Tom, what can I do for you this fine morning?" Pete asked with a hint of humor in his voice. "Pete, I've got a situation here at the bridge. Someone's put up a gate, and they're claiming I can't access my own property without paying some kind of fee to an HOA I've never heard of." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low whistle. "An HOA, you say? That's news to me. I've been patrolling that area for 15 years, and I've never heard of any homeowners association out there. You sure you're reading that sign right?" Tom described the gate and the sign in detail, while Pete listened with growing interest. The sheriff promised to drive out within the hour to take a look at the situation himself. In the meantime, he advised Tom not to damage the gate or ignore the signs even if they seemed illegitimate. While waiting for Pete to arrive, Tom decided to do some investigating of his own. He had noticed several houses on the lake that hadn't been there during his last visit in the fall. The area had always been sparsely populated, with maybe a dozen cabins scattered around the shoreline, but now he could see at least 20 new structures, ranging from modest vacation homes to elaborate mansions that looked completely out of place in the rustic setting. He drove around the public access road that circled most of the lake, stopping to examine some of the newer construction. Many of the houses displayed small signs indicating they were part of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. The architecture was uniform and expensive, all gleaming cedar and expansive glass windows designed to showcase lake views. These weren't simple weekend retreats like his family's cabin. These were serious investments. At the third house he stopped, Tom encountered his first resident. A middle-aged man in pressed khakis and a polo shirt was washing an expensive SUV in his driveway. When Tom introduced himself and asked about the HOA, the man's demeanor shifted from friendly to suspicious. "You're not a resident here, are you?" the man asked pointedly. "This is a private community now. We've had problems with outsiders using our lake for fishing and camping without permission." Tom explained that his family had owned property on the lake for decades, but the man just shook his head. That was before the community was properly organized, he said. Margaret Whitmore, our association president, has been working hard to establish proper standards and security. If you have legitimate access rights, you'll need to go through the proper channels. When Tom asked what those proper channels might be, the man suggested contacting the HOA office during business hours and provided a phone number. He then returned to washing his SUV, making it clear that the conversation was over. Pete Rodriguez arrived at the bridge 20 minutes later, his patrol car kicking up a small cloud of dust as he pulled up behind Tom's truck. The sheriff was a compact man in his early 50s with graying temples and the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his career outdoors. He examined the gate and sign with professional thoroughness, taking photos and making notes in his ever-present notebook. "This is interesting," Pete said after completing his inspection. "The gate itself is on public right-of-way, which could be a problem. But more importantly, I've never seen any paperwork about an HOA being established out here. That kind of thing has to go through the county, and there's usually a fair amount of bureaucracy involved." Tom showed Pete his property deed, which clearly indicated access rights via the existing bridge. The sheriff studied the document, carefully comparing it to a county map he kept in his patrol car. "Your deed is solid," Pete confirmed. "This bridge access has been established for 40 years at least, maybe longer. I'm going to need to do some research, but my gut tells me this HOA is overstepping their bounds in a big way." As they spoke, a black Mercedes SUV approached from the far side of the bridge. The driver was a woman in her 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and an expression that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way. She stopped beside the gate and rolled down her window. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said in a crisp voice that carried just a hint of condescension. "This is private property. Are you lost?" Pete stepped forward and identified himself as the sheriff. The woman's expression shifted slightly, showing a flicker of uncertainty before resuming its composed mask. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. Is there some kind of problem here?" Tom introduced himself and explained his situation while Margaret listened with barely concealed impatience. When he finished, she pulled out a tablet computer and scrolled through several screens before looking up with a tight smile. "Mr. Mitchell, I see that your property is indeed listed in our records. However, you've failed to comply with our community standards and registration requirements. The gate was installed for security purposes and to ensure that only authorized residents have access to our private roads and amenities." Tom pointed out that the bridge wasn't a private road, but public right-of-way, and that his family had been using it long before any HOA existed. Margaret's smile grew even tighter. "Mr. Mitchell, the Pine Lake community has evolved considerably in recent years. We've made substantial investments in infrastructure security and environmental protection. These improvements benefit everyone, but they require proper funding and oversight. Your unwillingness to participate in our community governance is frankly quite disappointing." Pete intervened, asking Margaret for documentation proving the HOA authority to restrict bridge access. She promised to provide the necessary paperwork within 24 hours, but made it clear that the gate would remain in place until Tom complied with community requirements. After Margaret drove away, Pete shook his head in obvious frustration. "Something about this whole situation stinks," he told Tom. "I've seen this kind of thing before, where new money moves into an area and starts pushing around the old-timers. But they can't just block legal access to your property, no matter how official their paperwork looks." Tom spent the rest of the day researching the Pine Lake Homeowners Association online. What he found was impressive and concerning in equal measure. The HOA had a professional website complete with architectural guidelines, financial reports, and a board of directors that read like a who's who of local business leaders. Margaret Whitmore was listed as president with an impressive resume that included years of experience in municipal planning and community development. The association claimed responsibility for road maintenance, landscaping, security patrols, and environmental monitoring throughout the Pine Lake area. Their annual budget exceeded $500,000 funded through homeowner assessments and fees. The website made numerous references to preserving the natural beauty and exclusive character of the community, but nowhere in all the documentation could Tom find any legal justification for blocking his access to the bridge. The HOA authority seemed to extend only to properties that had voluntarily joined the association and agreed to its covenants. His family's cabin had never been part of any such agreement. That evening, Tom called his lawyer David Chen, a solo practitioner who had handled his father's estate and other family legal matters over the years. David listened to the situation with growing interest, asking detailed questions about the property deed, the bridge access, and the HOA claims. "This is fascinating," David said when Tom finished his account. "What you're describing sounds like a classic case of HOA overreach. They're probably hoping you'll just pay the fees rather than fight them legally. But if your deed clearly grants bridge access, then they're essentially trying to extort money from you." David agreed to research the legal issues and promised to contact the county records office to verify the HOA official status. He warned Tom that legal action could be expensive and time-consuming, but assured him that the case seemed winnable based on what he had described. As the sun set over Pine Lake, Tom sat in his truck staring at the locked gate that stood between him and his family's cabin. The situation was more complex than a simple property dispute. Someone was making a serious play for control of the entire lake area, and they were willing to use questionable legal tactics to achieve their goals. What Margaret Whitmore and her HOA board didn't know was that Tom Mitchell wasn't just another weekend property owner who could be intimidated into compliance. He was a retired civil engineer who had spent his career building bridges and highways across 3 states. More importantly, his family didn't just own a cabin on Pine Lake. They owned something far more valuable and strategically important. When Tom's grandfather had purchased the original property in 1954, the deed included something that most people would overlook: a small but crucial piece of information buried in the legal description. The Mitchell family didn't just have access rights to cross the bridge, they owned the bridge itself along with the small parcels of land on both sides where it was anchored. It was an odd quirk of local history, dating back to the early settlement days, when the county had sold the bridge to private interests to avoid maintenance costs. Over the decades, ownership had passed through several hands before ending up as part of the larger property purchase that Tom's grandfather had negotiated. The county had been happy to transfer the responsibility and liability to a private owner who promised to maintain public access. Tom had discovered this detail years earlier while researching the property boundaries for an insurance claim. At the time, it had seemed like an interesting piece of family history, but nothing more. Now, however, it represented something potentially much more significant. If the Pine Lake HOA wanted to control access to their exclusive community, they were going to have to negotiate with the person who actually owned the only way in or out. As darkness fell over the lake, Tom smiled for the first time that day. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. Chapter 2. The next morning, Tom arrived at his lawyer's office, carrying a thick folder of documents he had retrieved from his home, safe during the night. David Chen's office was located in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, the kind of building that suggested competence without ostentation. David had been practicing law in the county for over 20 years and had developed a reputation for thorough preparation and creative problem solving. David poured coffee for both of them while Tom spread the documents across the conference table. The original deed from 1954 was written in the formal language of the era with precise legal descriptions that seemed almost quaint by modern standards. But buried in the middle of the second page was the key passage that Tom had remembered. Together with the timber bridge crossing Clearwater Creek, including all approach roads, abutments, and supporting structures, together with the perpetual right to maintain said bridge and collect reasonable tolls for its use, subject to county approval of toll schedules. David read the passage 3 times before looking up with raised eyebrows. "This is remarkable," he said. "I've never seen anything quite like this in a modern property deed. Your family doesn't just have access rights, you actually own the infrastructure." Tom nodded and pulled out a county survey map from 1962 that showed the bridge ownership clearly marked. The map indicated that the Mitchell family property extended 50 feet on either side of the bridge on both shores, creating a narrow corridor of private land that any vehicle had to cross to reach the Pine Lake community. David studied the survey, carefully comparing it to modern county records on his computer. "The ownership appears to be legitimate," he confirmed. "The county records show the bridge and approach roads as private property with a public easement for access." But here's the interesting part. The easement agreement specifically reserves the owner's right to regulate use as long as reasonable public access is maintained. The implications were staggering. If the HOA wanted to restrict access to their community, they were doing so across private property that they had no legal authority to control. Moreover, Tom's family had the legal right to charge tolls for bridge use subject only to county approval of the rates. David suggested that they request a formal survey to confirm the current property boundaries, and then file a complaint with the county regarding the unauthorized gate installation. In the meantime, he would research the HOA legal status and look for any procedural violations in their establishment. While David began his research, Tom decided to drive back to the lake to document the situation more thoroughly. He brought a digital camera and measuring tape, planning to create a detailed record of the gate installation and any damage to his property. When he arrived at the bridge, he found Margaret Whitmore waiting for him. She was dressed in an expensive business suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Tom's monthly Social Security check. 2 other people stood beside her, a nervous-looking man in his 40s and a woman taking notes on a tablet computer. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss your situation like reasonable adults." Tom remained polite but distant as Margaret introduced her companions. The man was Robert Hayes, the HOA legal counsel, and the woman was Lisa Park, their community manager. Both looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick contract. "We've prepared a retroactive membership agreement for your property," she announced. "Given your family's long history in the area, we're prepared to waive the usual initiation fees. You'll only need to pay the standard annual assessment of $5,000 plus the $2,000 bridge access fee." Tom examined the contract briefly, noting that it was filled with legal jargon about community standards, architectural review committees, and extensive restrictions on property use. The document would essentially give the HOA authority over every aspect of his cabin, from paint colors to guest policies. "This is generous," Margaret continued, "but it's also our final offer. The community has voted to implement strict access controls, and we can't make exceptions even for longtime residents." Tom folded the contract and handed it back to Margaret. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but I'm not interested in joining your association. My family has been using this bridge for decades without any problems." Margaret's expression hardened. "Mr. Mitchell, you don't seem to understand the situation. The Pine Lake community has been transformed over the past 2 years. We've invested millions of dollars in infrastructure improvements, environmental protection, and security measures. These investments have dramatically increased property values for everyone in the area, including your cabin." She gestured toward the lake, where several expensive boats were visible at private docks. Property values here have increased by an average of 40% since we established the HOA. Your cabin is probably worth twice what it was 3 years ago. We're not asking for charity, we're asking you to pay your fair share for improvements that benefit you directly. Tom considered Margaret's argument, which had some merit. The new construction around the lake was impressive, and property values had undoubtedly increased. But the fundamental issue remained unchanged. His family owned their property free and clear with established access rights that predated any HOA. I understand your position, Tom replied, but my property access is protected by deed and county records going back 70 years. You can't simply decide to charge me fees for using my own legal access route. Robert Hayes stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Mitchell, perhaps we could discuss some kind of compromise. The HOA board is willing to consider alternative arrangements for legacy properties like yours. Before Tom could respond, Margaret cut off her lawyer with a sharp gesture. There are no alternative arrangements, she declared. Every property in this community follows the same rules. If Mr. Mitchell wants access, he pays the fees like everyone else. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but it was clear that Margaret had no intention of negotiating. She was convinced that Tom would eventually cave to the pressure, rather than fight a legal battle against a well-funded HOA. Her confidence suggested that this strategy had worked before with other property owners. After Margaret and her team departed, Tom spent an hour photographing and measuring the gate installation. The structure was even more substantial than he had initially realized, with concrete footings and professional-grade hardware. Someone had spent serious money to make a statement. More importantly, the gate was clearly installed on his property according to the survey markers he located. The HOA had not only blocked his access, they had done so by trespassing on land they didn't own and had no right to use. Tom called David Chen from his truck and reported on the morning's encounter. David listened carefully and asked several questions about the exact location of the gate and the wording of Margaret's demands. "This keeps getting better," David said with obvious satisfaction. "They've essentially admitted to trespassing on your property and attempting to extort money for access to your own land. I think it's time to take the gloves off." David explained that he had already filed a complaint with the county about the unauthorized gate installation. The county engineer was planning to inspect the site within 48 hours to determine whether any permits had been obtained for construction in the public right-of-way. More significantly, David had discovered some interesting information about the Pine Lake HOA legal status. While the association had filed the proper paperwork with the state, their authority was limited to properties that had voluntarily agreed to join. They had no power to impose fees or restrictions on existing properties that had never signed covenant agreements. The HOA appears to be operating under the assumption that they can force compliance through intimidation, David explained. It's a risky strategy that could expose them to significant legal liability if they've been collecting fees from people who weren't legally obligated to pay. David suggested that Tom consider filing a civil lawsuit against the HOA for trespass, interference with property rights, and possibly extortion. The case would be expensive and time-consuming, but the legal theory was solid, and the potential damages could be substantial. However, David also mentioned another option that could be far more effective and satisfying. Given Tom's ownership of the bridge and approach roads, he could potentially take action that would completely reverse the power dynamic between himself and the HOA. What if instead of fighting their access restrictions you imposed your own, David suggested. You own the bridge. You have the legal right to charge tolls subject to county approval. What would happen if you decided to exercise that right? Tom was quiet for a long moment as the implications sank in. The Pine Lake community was accessible by only one road which crossed his bridge. If he chose to implement toll charges, every resident of the exclusive community would have to pay him for the privilege of reaching their expensive homes. The county approval process could take several months, but David was confident that reasonable toll rates would be approved, especially if they were justified by bridge maintenance costs. Tom could potentially generate substantial income while making a powerful statement about property rights and legal overreach. That evening, Tom sat on his front porch reviewing copies of all the bridge ownership documents. The original toll collection right had never been formally abandoned, which meant it was still legally valid. The 1954 deed specifically granted his family the authority to charge reasonable fees for bridge use subject only to county oversight. The irony was almost too perfect. Margaret Whitmore and her HOA wanted to charge him fees for accessing his own property. In response, he could charge fees to every resident of their exclusive community for accessing their properties. The legal authority was clear, and the precedent was well established in county records. Tom called his son Michael, who lived in Denver and worked as a business consultant. Michael had visited the cabin many times over the years and was familiar with the property's history. When Tom explained the situation, Michael was initially skeptical, but became increasingly excited as he understood the legal implications. "Dad, this is incredible," Michael said. "You're sitting on a gold mine. Do you have any idea what those people paid for their houses? If property values have increased 40%, like that woman claimed, you could be looking at properties worth anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million each." Michael offered to research comparable toll rates from similar situations around the country. He also suggested consulting with a business attorney who specialized in public utilities and toll collection operations. As Tom prepared for bed that night, he reflected on how quickly the situation had evolved. 24 hours earlier, he had been an angry property owner blocked from accessing his family cabin. Now he was potentially in position to control access to an entire exclusive community worth tens of millions of dollars. The next morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Tom was no longer on the defensive. Margaret Whitmore had made a serious tactical error by underestimating her opponent and overplaying her hand. She was about to discover that some battles are won not by having the most money or the best lawyers, but by understanding who actually holds the real power. Chapter 3. The county engineer arrived at precisely 9 o'clock Thursday morning, driving a white pickup truck with official markings and a load of surveying equipment in the back. Tom had been waiting since 8:30, wanting to be present when the inspection took place. He recognized the engineer Bill Morrison from previous encounters over the years when Tom had consulted on various county infrastructure projects during his active engineering career. Bill stepped out of his truck and shook Tom's hand with a firm grip and a puzzled expression. "Tom, I got to say, this is one of the stranger situations I've encountered in 20 years of county work. You want to explain to me what's going on here, because the complaint we received makes it sound like someone installed unauthorized structures on your private property." Tom walked Bill through the entire situation, from the original gate installation to Margaret Whitmore's demands for HOA fees. Bill listened carefully while examining the gate structure and reviewing the survey markers that defined the property boundaries. "This gate is definitely on your land," Bill confirmed after completing his measurements. "Whoever installed this didn't bother to check property lines or obtain permits. That's a pretty serious oversight for what appears to be a professional construction job." Bill photographed the gate installation from multiple angles and took detailed measurements of its location relative to the established property markers. He also examined the concrete footings, which had clearly been poured without any consideration for underground utilities or drainage patterns. "The installation violates at least 3 county ordinances," Bill explained. They needed permits for construction, in the right-of-way, approval for any structure that could affect traffic flow, and environmental review for concrete work near the creek. "I don't see any indication that they even attempted to follow proper procedures." While Bill continued his inspection, Tom noticed a small convoy of vehicles approaching from the direction of the lake community. Margaret Whitmore was in the lead car, followed by two other expensive SUVs carrying what appeared to be additional HOA board members and possibly more legal representation. Margaret parked her Mercedes and approached with determined strides, clearly unhappy about the county involvement. She was dressed even more formally than the previous day, wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, addressing Bill directly. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. I understand there's been some confusion about our community access controls, but I assure you we've followed all proper procedures." Bill looked up from his notebook with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult property owners. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see permits and approval documents for this gate installation. The structure appears to be located on private property without proper authorization." Margaret opened her briefcase and produced a thick folder of documents. "We have complete documentation for all our community improvements," she said confidently. "The gate was installed as part of our comprehensive security enhancement program." Bill spent several minutes reviewing Margaret's paperwork while Tom watched with growing interest. The documents appeared impressive at first glance, but Bill's expression suggested that appearances could be deceiving. "Ma'am, these documents authorize gate installation on HOA property within your community," Bill said carefully. "But this particular gate is located on Mr. Mitchell's private land, not on property controlled by your association. Did you obtain permission from the property owner before beginning construction?" Margaret's confidence wavered slightly. "The HOA board voted to implement community-wide security measures," she replied. "We assumed that all property owners in the area would support improved security." Bill shook his head. "Ma'am, property ownership doesn't work that way. You can't install structures on someone else's land just because you think it's a good idea. This gate needs to be removed immediately, or Mr. Mitchell would be within his rights to remove it himself." Conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Margaret becoming increasingly defensive and threatening legal action against the county. Bill remained professional but firm, explaining that county ordinances existed for good reasons and couldn't be ignored regardless of anyone's good intentions. After Margaret and her entourage departed, Bill completed his inspection and prepared his official report. The gate installation was clearly in violation of multiple county regulations and would need to be removed within 30 days. If the HOA failed to comply, the county would remove the structure and bill them for the costs. Bill also confirmed Tom's ownership of the bridge and approach roads, noting that the county records were clear and unambiguous. The public easement for bridge access didn't grant any authority to private organizations to restrict or regulate use. Before leaving, Bill pulled Tom aside for a private conversation. "Tom, I've been thinking about your situation, and there's something you should know. The county has been getting complaints about the Pine Lake HOA for months now. They've been pretty aggressive about trying to expand their authority beyond what's legally permitted." Bill explained that several other property owners had been pressured to join the HOA or face various restrictions on their access and use of lake facilities. Most had eventually given in rather than fight expensive legal battles, but a few had filed formal complaints with the county. The HOA has been operating under the assumption that they can create facts on the ground and worry about legal challenges later. Bill said, "It's a risky strategy, but it's been working because most people don't want to spend thousands of dollars on lawyers to fight over what seems like minor issues." Tom thanked Bill for the information and promised to keep him informed about any further developments. As the county engineer drove away, Tom considered his options with growing determination. The HOA pattern of behavior suggested that Margaret Whitmore was accustomed to getting her way through intimidation and superior resources. She was about to discover that this approach had significant limitations. That afternoon, Tom drove to the county courthouse to research toll collection procedures and requirements. The county clerk's office maintained extensive records of historical toll operations dating back to the territorial period. Tom discovered that several private toll bridges had operated in the county over the years, with rates ranging from 25 cents per vehicle in the 1960s to current rates of up to $5 for complex crossing operations. The approval process for toll collection was straightforward but thorough. Tom would need to submit a detailed application, including justification for the toll rates, proposed maintenance schedules, and provisions for public access. The county commissioners would review the application at a public hearing and could approve reasonable rates that were justified by operational costs. Tom also learned that toll collection rights, once established, were difficult to challenge legally. As long as the rates were reasonable and the bridge was properly maintained, the county had limited authority to revoke toll privileges. Several historical cases had established strong legal precedents protecting private toll collection rights. The research took most of the afternoon, but Tom left the courthouse with copies of all the relevant forms and procedures. He also had a much clearer understanding of the legal and financial implications of implementing toll collection at his bridge. That evening, Tom called David Chen to discuss the county engineer's findings and the toll collection research. David was pleased with Bill Morrison's report and confident that it would provide strong evidence for any legal action against the HOA. "The toll collection option is fascinating," David said. "I've researched some comparable situations, and the legal precedents are very favorable. If you decide to pursue this, the HOA would have very limited options for challenging your authority." David explained that toll collection would essentially reverse the power dynamic between Tom and the Pine Lake community. Instead of being pressured to pay fees to the HOA, every resident of the community would be required to pay tolls to access their properties. The psychological impact could be even more significant than the financial impact, David continued. These are people who are accustomed to controlling their environment and having things their way. Being forced to pay tolls to someone they've been trying to intimidate could be quite a shock. Tom asked about potential legal challenges to toll collection, and David's assessment was encouraging. As long as the tolls were reasonable and proper procedures were followed, the HOA would have no legal grounds to prevent implementation. They could potentially file lawsuits claiming various violations, but such challenges would be expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed. More importantly, toll collection would generate income that could fund Tom's legal defense against any HOA challenges. Instead of fighting an expensive legal battle with limited resources, he would have ongoing revenue to support his position. After ending the call with David, Tom spent the evening calculating potential toll revenues based on traffic counts and comparable rates from similar operations. The Pine Lake community included approximately 40 homes with an average of 2 vehicles per household. Assuming normal traffic patterns for weekend and vacation properties, he estimated daily traffic of 50 to 100 vehicles during peak periods. At a toll rate of $5 per vehicle, Tom could potentially generate $250 to $500 per day during busy weekends. Annual revenues could easily reach $50,000 to $75,000, more than enough to cover bridge maintenance costs and legal expenses while providing significant additional income. The financial projections were impressive, but the strategic implications were even more significant. Margaret Whitmore and her HOA board had created their exclusive community based on the assumption that they could control access and impose their will on surrounding property owners. Toll collection would demonstrate that real power came from actual ownership, not from expensive lawyers and intimidation tactics. Tom went to bed that night with a clear plan of action. Tomorrow, he would begin the formal process of implementing toll collection at his bridge. Margaret Whitmore wanted to play hardball over property rights and access fees. She was about to discover that some games had rules she didn't understand and opponents she hadn't properly evaluated. The battle for control of Pine Lake access was about to shift dramatically in Tom's favor. Chapter 4. Friday morning, Tom drove directly to the county planning office carrying a completed toll application and supporting documentation he had prepared the previous evening. The application was thorough, including detailed justifications for proposed toll rates, maintenance schedules, financial projections, and provisions for emergency access. He had learned from his engineering career that bureaucratic processes moved more smoothly when applications were complete and professionally presented. The planning office receptionist directed Tom to the desk of Janet Walsh, a senior planner who specialized in transportation and utility issues. Janet had worked for the county for over 15 years and had a reputation for practical problem solving and attention to detail. "This is interesting," Janet said after reviewing Tom's application. "I've seen plenty of development-related toll proposals over the years, but this is the first time someone has applied to implement tolls on an existing private bridge. The documentation looks complete, but I'll need to do some research on the legal precedents." Janet explained that the county commissioners typically scheduled public hearings for toll applications within 60 days of submission. The hearing would provide an opportunity for public comment and allow the HOA or other interested parties to present their objections. However, the legal standards for toll approval were well established, and reasonable rates were typically approved without significant controversy. Tom asked about potential challenges to the application, and Janet's assessment was generally optimistic. "Your ownership documentation is solid," she said, "and the proposed rates are well within normal parameters. The main issue will be ensuring proper public notice and following all procedural requirements." Janet promised to expedite the initial review process and contact Tom within a week about scheduling the public hearing. She also provided him with copies of recent toll approval decisions from other counties that could serve as useful precedents. While leaving the planning office, Tom encountered Bill Morrison, who was entering the building for a meeting about another project. Bill stopped to chat and mentioned that he had received several phone calls from Margaret Whitmore and HOA attorneys about the bridge gate situation. "They're not happy about my inspection report," Bill said with obvious amusement. "Apparently they think the county should make an exception for their community improvement projects. I explained that property law doesn't work that way, but they seem convinced that rules don't apply to them." Bill also mentioned that the county attorney had reviewed the gate situation and confirmed that the HOA had no legal authority to install structures on Tom's property. The county was prepared to support removal of the gate if necessary, and would not be intimidated by threats of legal action from HOA attorneys. After completing his county business, Tom decided to drive around Pine Lake to get a better understanding of the community. He was about to start charging tolls to access. The development was even more impressive than he had initially realized, with architectural standards that clearly required substantial investment from each property owner. Most of the homes were large modern structures designed to maximize lake views and outdoor living spaces. Private docks extended into the lake, with expensive boats and watercraft moored alongside. Carefully manicured landscaping and coordinated exterior lighting created an atmosphere of tasteful luxury throughout the community. Tom stopped at several locations to observe traffic patterns and estimate vehicle counts. Even on a weekday morning, there was steady activity, with landscaping crews, construction workers, delivery trucks, and residents coming and going. Weekend traffic would obviously be much heavier when owners arrived for recreational stays. At one overlook, Tom encountered an elderly man walking a small dog along a well-maintained trail. The man introduced himself as Frank Peterson, a retired accountant who had moved to Pine Lake 2 years earlier after selling his accounting practice in the city. Frank was friendly and talkative, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share his enthusiasm for the community. "The HOA has done amazing work, organizing everything," he said, with obvious pride. "When we first moved here, it was pretty rustic, but Margaret Whitmore and the board have really transformed the area." Tom asked Frank about the HOA fees and requirements, curious about the financial burden on community residents. Frank confirmed that annual assessments were substantial, but explained that most residents considered them worthwhile given the level of services and amenities provided. "We pay about $8,000 per year in HOA fees," Frank said, "but that covers road maintenance, landscaping, security patrols, and all the common area upkeep. When you consider what we'd pay for similar services individually, it's actually quite reasonable." Tom mentioned that he owned property in the area and was considering joining the HOA. Frank immediately became more animated, offering to introduce Tom to other board members and praising Margaret's leadership abilities. "Margaret can be pretty direct sometimes," Frank said, "but she gets things done. Before she became president, this place was just a collection of random cabins with no coordination or standards. Now we have a real community with proper governance and long-term planning." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Frank providing detailed information about HOA operations, community events, and future development plans. Tom learned that the association was considering additional amenities, including a community center, clubhouse, and possibly a private marina. All of these improvements would require additional assessments and fees, but Frank seemed confident that residents would approve the necessary funding. "Property values have increased so much that most people consider the HOA investments to be excellent financial decisions," he explained. After parting company with Frank, Tom continued his tour of the community with a better understanding of the residents' perspective. These were people who had made substantial investments in their properties and were accustomed to high levels of service and amenities. They had chosen Pine Lake specifically because it offered exclusivity, privacy, and professional management. The irony of the situation was becoming increasingly clear. The same exclusivity and control that attracted residents to Pine Lake made them vulnerable to anyone who could restrict their access to the community. Tom's bridge ownership gave him leverage that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could overcome. That afternoon, Tom received a phone call from David Chen with updates on the legal research he had been conducting. David had discovered additional information about the HOA establishment and operations that raised questions about their legal authority. "The HOA was incorporated 2 years ago," David explained, "but their authority is limited to